Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we are talking about the brown-headed cowbird, and it's a wild one. I'd always heard that they lay their eggs in other birds' nests, but didn't realize that their species 100% relies on other birds to raise their young. The lengths they go to are pretty extreme as well. John and Shannon teach us about how these mafia birds will watch the nests of other birds, and if other birds aren't raising their young for them, then they will destroy the nests, sometimes killing the other birds. This whole episode is just super bizarre, but it's also super fascinating at the same time, so get your popcorn ready. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. All right, well, welcome back, everybody, to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ, and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda. And before we get into talking about the brown-headed cowbird, just a little bit of housekeeping. Our round-robin tournament is finally over after a couple months, it feels like. And the American woodcock won, so thank you, everyone, for voting and participating. We're going to send some free stickers out to people that did vote. So you can, if you voted, email us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Tell us that you voted, give us your address, and we'll send you some stickers, and we'll post some pictures of what those stickers like online. But woodcock is our bird of the year. Any thoughts on the woodcock?
I'll try not to hold it against all of you and everyone else for not writing in shoebill, which is clearly better.
I think I said this before, there's always next year.
Yes, that's right.
And maybe woodcocks are due to repeat.
I hope so.
No,
I hope so.
Woodcocks won't be in the mix next year. We'll have a whole new series of things that people
can
vote.
They keep their team out of the transfer portal.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Well, I went back and listened to the episode, and I totally forgot you had talked about how there are woodcock that are already arriving with like an egg inside of them before they get to the breeding grounds. And I totally forgot about that and thought that was a really fascinating.
I didn't say they weren't cool. They're just not coolest.
I mean, it's a great example of things that we wouldn't know if we didn't have collections. And so they come in from the window kills, and we can, as we're prepping the specimens, we can assess the reproductive condition. And so that's how they figured that out. It's a really an interesting aspect of their biology, for sure.
Wow.
What does it mean that they're breeding before they get to their breeding grounds?
Well, it just means that, well, what it means overall is an interesting question, but I think it's the opportunity presents itself, and so they're definitely mating and showing up with shelled eggs, and I guess from an evolutionary standpoint, maybe what it implies is that that's a strategy that actually has some benefit. I don't really know what it is. I mean, I guess it gets you to be laying your eggs earlier on than maybe some of the birds that are waiting to mate until they get all the way up. But those are interesting questions that you really need to have more scientific data on.
It defies what we know about migration biology, that the only extra weight you want to have is fat to fuel your migration. But so you're migrating with a weight in you, a fully shelled egg, which is interesting. And I always looked at it slightly differently, and that is when we try to assess how far individuals move from where they're born to where they reproduce, these things tell us something about the population structure of populations. And you go there, and if you're going to sample individuals, you're assuming that the mate is in that area, right? But if that mate that you're together with on the breeding grounds, so they, have sex, develop a baby in that egg, and then the male goes to somewhere else from the female, that gene flow is not happening on the breeding grounds. That gene flow is happening in the wintering grounds. And so it can really mess up how you look at population biology and genetic differentiation. That's a whole variable that's we don't usually calculate into trying to understand the population dynamics of birds. And so you could misinterpret a whole bunch of genetic data if you didn't know that natural history fact. So it is pretty interesting.
It's a way of saying there's almost certainly a dissertation for somebody in some of the sampling that's sitting in the museum.
Yeah. What enables an individual to do that? Is there something superior about them, or is it easier for woodcocks to migrate, either such that it's not so devastating to an individual to fly. What percentage of the population actually does that? We don't know any of those things.
Have there been a lot of woodcock that have been added to the collection this migration season?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say there almost always are. I feel like in general, and I haven't paid quite as much attention to stuff as it's been logged in this time around, it seems like it's fewer birds. And, you'd like to think that maybe that's the result of the downtown buildings doing a better job with respect to turning off lights. It could also be some aspects of the way the winds have been blowing this migration. They're just pushing birds away from the city a little bit.
That's exciting. I feel like hopefully it seems like there's more awareness.
There's absolutely more awareness.
That's great.
Until it fades. And that's why routines, people who are in charge of and who own buildings need to have routines that don't enable them to forget.
Yeah.
That, if you put your keys in the same place every day when you get home, John, you'll find your keys when you leave without thinking too much.
I have an app for that.
Yeah, right. But can you use the app? That's the issue. And if it's a routine, then you're less likely to do it. If it's a chore or something you view as unimportant or a burden, or if it's not part of the normal process of managing your building, then it just fades away because the attention fades away until it doesn't, and your building kills a whole bunch of birds at one time, and our graduate students post on social media and create a furor. And then there's a lot of attention to it, and then it dies back again. We need to all work together to make buildings function better for not just the people who book events or have conventions or live in a building, but for the birds that fly through Chicago. Nobody wants to be seen as the bird killing center of the world, right? Especially when we have enough data now to know how you prevent that from happening. Yes. How you can minimize the number of birds that smash into windows. We know that light regimes make a really big difference. Closing your lights, closing your blinds, closing the curtains, really makes a substantial difference in reducing the number of birds that fly into windows. So it can be done. Chicago's done it. We have data to show that it works. So
hopefully we can just keep awareness on everybody's mind so it doesn't fade out.
Yeah, not in a sensational way, right? Because, of course, when that many birds kill themselves, it's a big thing, and there's a lot of sensationalism. But the only way it persists and not just be some social media storm or some sensational event is that people learn the lesson of what that means and not just the drama of it. And so that's what part that bothers me is the drama. And the drama, too much drama, can influence our ability to convince building managers that we're sane and rational when we're asking for these things and not just, going off of a deep end or something like that. Because we all have to work together for this.
Yeah.
But woodcock still should not have won.
Next year.
Yeah, we'll see if they're a powerhouse.
Everybody's untrustworthy. If woodcock wins this year, heaven only knows what you're going to do next year. Wrong turn everyone's going to take.
Well, I'm curious to see how brown-headed cowbird would do in a tournament because it seems like they would play dirty.
I'm kidding. That depends on your criteria.
Yeah.
Doesn't it? Or where you place your value.
Well, I'm sure with brown-headed cowbird, we'll get into kind of the parasitism and all the stuff that they do later on. But just to start, should we talk a little bit about their appearance and kind of give an overview for our listeners who aren't familiar with them?
Yeah, so they're a member of the Oriole and Blackbird family, the Icteridae, which is an entirely New World family. So they're only in North and South America. And there's a group of related birds called cowbirds. And only now 3 of them actually reach North America. And it's interesting because across the 5 or 6 species, they have various types of parasitism, and some of them are very specific, meaning they only parasitize a few species.
And we don't mean fleas and mites and lice and things like that.
In terms of parasites.
Yeah, parasitism means that they lay their eggs in another bird's nests, so they're, a nest parasite in that sense. So they're parasitizing other birds.
Okay.
Which is kind of what they're famous for.
And brown-headed cowbird is found throughout the continental U.S. I mean, it's a very widespread bird, and so they're something that people should definitely be aware of. They have a really neat liquid call that they give, and so they're just something. And then they have a trill that they give too, and they're one of the first birds that shows up of the migrants in the spring, and immediately they start moving around the landscape, and it's clear that they're just looking for birds to follow around.
So they're really common at people's feeders at this time of year. And another interesting thing about them is that the males and females look really super different. So if you're going to see a male, you're going to see this brown-headed, well, that's in its name, but a brown-headed bird with kind of an iridescent body. And the females are streaky, and if you didn't look at a bird book, you wouldn't even put them in the same species. So the males and females look really, really different.
We've been noticing them around the neighborhood, and we think the males are just like kind of weird looking. Like it's like the black and the brown really kind of clash. The type of feather on their head looks different than the rest of their body. Like there's something about them that just like is kind of strange, I feel like. More so than other.
Is that what you're saying?
I would say that.
Even before you know their behaviors?
Yes, yeah.
No, I think it's an interesting observation, and I'd agree with you. And it's, at the same time, presumably that plumage evolved because females are attracted to males that look like that, which is really interesting, given that it's such a strange color combination.
Yeah, and the feather type seems different on their head too. Like it almost looks like it shaved its head or something, and it's growing back compared to the rest of its body.
There are different arrangements of the way melanin, which is producing these colors, are in the feathers. So it's different in that brown, that very dull brown that's their head, versus what the melanin is inside the feathers in the brilliant kind of
black
iridescent part.
Okay.
So yeah, they do have different internal bits of their feathers or different internal arrangements of those things.
Okay. Huh.
And why are they called cowbirds?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the history of these birds is they were mostly a plains bird, and cow is, I think, essentially referring to bison. They probably hung around bison historically, and then as there were cattle drives, they were probably around the cattle too.
I think, when I was doing research, it looks like they were, their common name was given in 1839 because they were near cows. That's a change in their distribution. When we started changing a lot of the landscape, they became more common. And then I got interested in who described them and why. And apparently they were described by Comte de Buffon in 1775. And he was a French naturalist that Ernst Mayr called the father of all thought in natural history in the 17th century. It was 18th century. And he was one of the first naturalists to recognize ecological succession. And for me, the most interesting thing is he was forced by the theology committee of the University of Paris to recant his geologic theories and animal evolution theories because they contradicted biblical creation stories. So, that's not very nice.
Yeah.
But, it was uncommon. So we always think the things that we experience today are now things. But, in reality, almost everything we experience, other people have experienced in the past, including persecution for thinking that evolution by natural selection is, one of the mechanisms that produces diversity. So you'd like to think that would go away because we have a lot of evidence that evolution is real.
Yeah.
This is not an artificial phenomenon. This is not made up by scientists. There's plenty of evidence for evolution.
So getting into the parasitism then, so they lay their eggs in other birds' nests. So do they not build nests at all?
They don't.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So it's
So they-
100%
Yep.
just laying their eggs in other birds'
Yep.
nests.
And if you think about it, there are all kinds of aspects of doing this which become really strange. So one is they lay their eggs in lots of different birds' nests, and that means that these chicks are being reared by non-conspecific parents in a situation where they have to, they have some very good capabilities to outcompete the birds that are in the nest with them. But at the same time, then they have to figure out that they're brown-headed cowbirds after the fact. And
Yeah.
that's really kind of amazing.
Yes.
Well, we're going to tell you some things about cowbirds that won't make you like them very much. And because I like words, I had to look up what thrush, which is the genus name of this bird, means, and it means struggle or battle, and sire and impregnate. So I thought that was hilarious. And adder means adder. It means dull, kind of dull black. So there you go.
That's cool.
Even their name is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I just, you guys have said you've noticed them in the neighborhood, and they're kind of fascinating to watch do what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they've used 220 different species in their nest. Everything from, and get this, a hummingbird.
What? we were
I know.
We were
to
joking
a
about
falcon
that.
or a hawk or
Oh,
some
no
kind of.
way.
I'll
Yeah.
bet that
So-
wasn't successful, but
I don't know.
yeah, I was in Perkins Woods up in Evanston on a Wednesday evening, and I heard something. I looked up, and there was a male brown-headed cowbird, and he flew off, and suddenly I realized there was another bird there, and it was a female, and she started wiggling, and then she dropped down a foot, and I thought, uh-oh, something's weird is different about this. And there was a robin's nest right there, and she just went right into the robin's nest, and she was probably there for 15 seconds, maybe less, before the robin chased her off. And I'll bet it was still enough time to lay an egg.
eggs.
Oh my gosh.
And we were walking by there actually this morning on a bird walk, and that nest looked like it was abandoned.
Oh, wow.
And so birds will do different things with respect to trying to protect their nesting effort in terms of when a cowbird parasitizes them. But it's an amazing strategy because a lot of these species don't recognize them.
Well, they also lay 40 eggs, the female does. So think about that. That's a lot more than the average, even if you re-nest several times.
Yeah. Is that 40 different nests then?
Yeah, although sometimes they'll put more than
More
one
than
egg
one? Okay. Wow.
In a nest. And they have all kinds of other, knock-on effects of doing that. So they've evolved to have their incubation periods shorter, so that their eggs will hatch first, which means that the parents who are programmed to feed, hormonally programmed to feed, will feed this giant thing that's often bigger than them, will feed them to the detriment of their own biologically related progeny. So, and then because they're so loud and the other babies are so loud because they're starving, it means you're attracting all kinds of attention to yourself, and it increases nest predation. So if you're making a lot of noise, it's basically a call to say, yeah, come over here. I have some helpless things here that are going to be tasty.
Yes.
But you had mentioned evolution early on in the discussion, and I every time I think about brown-headed cowbirds, they're just this fascinating anomaly of coming up with a whole bunch of evolutionary traits that just seem counterintuitive to actually get evolved in a species like this.
Yeah. It's crazy the variety of different birds that they do lay their eggs in. You said over like 220.
Yeah.
Like, is there, I mean, doesn't seem like they really lean towards like one species more than the other. It's just kind of wherever they can.
There are some
find.
species, though, that they nest in that really have significant population problems because of it. You know, I like bluebirds, and they're devastating to bluebird populations. Cowbirds are. And there's several other species, one of which we're going to talk about, the Kirtland's warbler, where that was a really important factor in their decline, and then in how populations recovered of that bird. So they have a pretty dramatic effect. They lower reproductive success of the species, the individuals that they put their eggs in. So and there have been a lot of strategies that the hosts have evolved to kind of figure this out. You know, some dump eggs, they'll dump a big egg out. But then again, some cowbird babies dump out the eggs of the host.
Gosh.
Get rid of the competition for food.
Gosh, that's crazy.
So, the whole thing is it's worse than a soap opera.
Yeah.
And I mean, you guys see them in your neighborhoods. They've adapted well to urban, semi-urban landscapes, and I think part of that is nests are easy to find. And one of the things about brown-headed cowbird is eastern North America was largely forested, and they tend not to be in big tracts of forest. And so they really benefited from habitat fragmentation as Europeans were moving westward and expanded their range and found a whole bunch of new species that they could potentially parasitize as a result.
Wow.
So there's a lot of creativity that host birds have had in response, including if you see the cowbird egg, they'll build another nest on top, and that kills the cowbird egg.
Okay.
So, hosts aren't defenseless, but it takes a lot to outcompete something that's evolved to sneakily, stealthily drop an egg in your nest when you are hormonally programmed to look after whatever's in that nest. And there are images online and videos online of these tiny little warblers feeding a cowbird baby. Sometimes the cowbird babies barely fit in the nest. They're so big that they're just like bursting out of the nest. And there's this little tiny warbler feeding these big giant cowbird babies.
That's crazy.
And then they have to go to cowbird school and learn how to be a cowbird.
Yeah. Shannon, what you're saying, I was wondering, I think, John, when you brought up mating, I was wondering, I don't know how birds know what they look like, but I imagine we know what we look like because we have mirrors but I imagine a baby bird could see its nest mates and think that's what I look like.
Yeah, but they don't seem to do that because they have innate abilities to get at least partway through what it means to be a cowbird.
Okay.
So if they're deprived, there's a lot of cowbirds too, so it's not like there are not opportunities for them to hear a cowbird and understand with their innate abilities that that's what I'm supposed to sound like. That's
who I am. Okay.
So they learn quickly, and so they're often called mafia birds because they will return to the nest. If you're a host and you throw at one of their eggs, they often return to the same nest and kill. They ransack the nest and kill the eggs or babies that are in there. I mean, that is not very nice.
So they'll lay the egg and then they hang out and monitor and make sure that everything is.
Apparently they revisit nests.
Oh my gosh.
So if they come by and see that their egg isn't the female, if they come by and see that the egg isn't still there, they get mad and lose their minds.
Figuring all this out has been a real fascination for a whole bunch of cowbird biologists. So there's a community out there that is across the country looked into this, various questions about how some of this stuff works. And I think there's still some mysteries there. So, Amanda, I don't fully know how these birds figure out they're cowbirds. You'll like, and it's even, as the cowbirds begin to get older at the end of the breeding season, they're just they start hanging out in places like cemeteries and parks and things. And I guess they start seeing other cowbirds, and that's got to be the time at which they're figuring it out, unless maybe
I think there's so many cowbirds, and they must have very fast learning responses and triggers by the environment so that they hear a cowbird that's going through and they innately know that that's a cowbird. So these little encounters tell them they're a cowbird and at least get them part of the way there. But apparently if they never hear cowbirds, they sing a little bit like a cowbird, but not completely like a cowbird. So there has to be a learning part of it.
That's typical of the general way in which passerine birds learn sound. They have these windows of opportunity when the birds are young. I didn't know that.
That's interesting.
The oldest one, because I'm fascinated by these things too, because some of these are unbelievable. The oldest one was 16 years and 11 months old, and we know that from banding data where people have banded and then recaptured, that's a pretty long time for a songbird to live that many years. I don't know how common that is.
And think about that times 40 eggs a year or whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's a lot of reproductive success.
Yeah.
Again.
Or it's a lot of slop, right? So if they lay that many eggs and only 5 of them produce viable young, that's better reproductive output than most songbirds would have.
Right.
If you lay 4 eggs, you'd be pretty lucky if all 4 survived to any way into adulthood, or because this is going to sound mean, but what matters from an evolutionary perspective is how many genes you put in the next generation. So that loss is a loss of your fitness, biological fitness. So there's reasons to protect your nest, not because they love their babies. This is not what it is. I know that sounds mean, but it's because they're protecting their genetic legacies.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting close on time. Is there anything else cowbird related we want to touch on?
Well, just to say that, again, they're migratory. So they're here in the breeding season in Chicago, and then they move south and they'll live in these gigantic roosts in the wintering range down in the southern part of the U.S.
But the southern U.S. ones don't migrate, right?
Right. They're ones that
sedentary.
actually, that are actually around year round.
So in the wintertime, in the southern parts of the U.S., you can have both migratory birds and resident birds in the same big, giant, and we're talking giant roosts of these birds, like thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of birds.
Up to several million, yeah.
And is it all kinds of blackbirds then in the roost, or
a lot of times it's not restricted just to cowbirds. It'll and actually that's commonplace to have grackles and red-winged blackbirds and yeah.
And they don't identify them as a nuisance when they're all roosting. It's just when they're
I think that's a really interesting question. I've always wondered about sort of how those roosts actually shake out with respect to dominance hierarchies and things like that. But I guess it's like anything, safety in numbers.
Yeah, and different in the breeding versus non-breeding season. So those territoriality displays and urges, that might not be such a driving factor in the winter when they're not protecting territories or defending territories or trying to attract a mate.
It'd also be interesting to know a lot of those big flocks are roosting in major agricultural areas, and so what they do in the morning is go off to find fields that have stuff for them to eat, and that's their primary diet in the non-breeding season. And so I wonder what that was like 500 years ago.
But DNA data could tell us something about the historical population sizes of these birds. So it's possible to learn to use what's there now and infer what might have happened in the past. When the big expansion of population numbers happened, were they always this numerous or not? Genomic data can give you insight into that.
The whole thing just made me wonder, like, this is total hypothetical, but what a cowbird would do if they never saw another bird and they needed to lay an egg. Like,
right? Could they actually figure out how to raise a chick if they?
Right.
No, they won't. They don't know how to build a nest.
They wouldn't. Yeah.
So they can't.
Yeah.
That's so bizarre.
That's so crazy. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it can't be the best strategy because it hasn't evolved that many times. Especially because they don't camouflage. And we should talk about birds that do try to camouflage in some way, but
you mean with eggs or camouflage?
With eggs or with mouth linings of chicks or something like that. Cowbirds don't care about. They're not trying to hide their eggs. They're not trying to mimic either the behavior or the color patterns or anything like that of their hosts. They don't do any of that. They just drop their eggs and bye-bye.
Oh, my gosh.
That's crazy.
All right. Well, I think we'll call it there then. John, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I just say, again, I'm going to put a plug in for cowbirds actually being pretty amazing parts of the North American avifauna, even if they do a lot of damage.
And I want to let people know that they're numerous in collections, too. We have 1,481 of them in our collections. So that's a large population size in our collections of these things. So they're not uncommon in collections.
I'm excited to talk more about them a little bit on our next episode about the Kirtland warbler, because I'm sure some have something to do with that. So
definitely.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. If you have a question, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Next week, we'll be back to talk about the Kirtland's warbler. Everyone have a great week. Love you all. Thanks.